Hello, my name is Zahar Karetsky, and this is Transitions Visions, a podcast series about and for the sustainability transitions community. Destabilisation of socio-technical regimes and the governance of this destabilisation. What is it? Is it possible? And what part does it play in transitions towards sustainability? These are the questions I discussed with Leonard Frank, a transitions scholar from the University of Freiburg. Leonard has recently defended his PhD thesis on destabilisation policies in agriculture, so stay tuned, also in case agriculture is your topic of interest. Please enjoy. Hello, Leonard. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much for having me, Zaha. It's a pleasure to be here.
Leonard Frank from Freiburg University, postdoc in sustainability governance. You have recently published defended your thesis on regime destabilisation. Actually, I have it open at the moment, so it's the full title is Regime Destabilisation Governance and Policy Change: Studies on European Agricultural Policy and Sustainability Transitions.
Exactly, yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, it's been quite the process, to be honest. So when I set out to write this PhD in early 2020, roughly, regime destabilization was a bit of a hot topic already, but much less so than today. There were far fewer publications, and no academic community had yet formed around the topic in the same way as it has today. And I was really interested in agricultural policy from before that. I have a background in political science and more interdisciplinary environmental social science, a bit of human geography. And I'd been studying agricultural policy for quite a while. And that was the time when the last process of reform of the common agricultural policy in the European Union was just unfolding. And I was wondering, okay, we in sustainability transitions, we've been talking for a number of years already about how regime destabilization and phase out and discontinuation are actually really important interventions for sustainability transitions, but we do not actually know to what extent these interventions are present in different policy fields, because almost all of the research at that time, pretty much exclusively, came from energy systems. And so it was a very simple idea at the core of it. The question was, we know the Common Agricultural Policy in the EU aims at a sustainability transition. They even use that wording. We know that for sustainability transitions, at least from a conceptual lens, regime destabilization and deliberate decline is relevant. So the question is, to what extent is there something like a policy aimed at deliberate decline and regime destabilization in the CAP? That was essentially the background, and took me a few years to grapple with that question.
Maybe let's set up the scene about regime destabilization. So maybe you could share how you conceptualize it in the thesis.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So the concept of regime destabilization, of course, alludes to socio-technical regimes. I guess the listeners to this podcast probably are quite familiar with this. And originally, the term was coined by three papers that came out in 2012, 2013. Two of them were published by Bruno Thornheim at the time, who argue that we should really be looking at not just how new regimes emerge from technological and social innovations, but at the long and unfolding process of how established regimes decline. And Bruno did that with a study of the the UK coal industry over, I don't know, 100 years or so. Very deep empirical work. And then the research on regime destabilization branched out a bit. And over the following years, some publications started to appear where people actually started to look at policy and the question to what extent policy can fulfill a function of, well, deliberately destabilizing regimes, sort of intervening into a socio-technical configuration to, well, weaken it and get rid of certain elements that are unwanted. And there's a seminal paper by Paula Kivima and Florian Kern from 2016 that I think started that. And what I draw on very strongly is, of course, that research, but then also later a shift towards conceptualizing regimes in terms of socio-technical configurations. So configurations of technological and social elements in a system that are more or less strongly institutionalized. So it becomes less a question of several kind of ontological levels, but the degree of institutionalization of a technology or a practice is more a question of degree. And that work draws strongly on the research by Lea Fünfschilling, which also by now is actually quite old. And I think this perspective on socio-technical configurations opens up new ways to analyze regime destabilization, because we can then ask, does the institutionalization of regime elements decline over time, or does it actually increase, or does it remain stable? And I think that is sort of, these are within transition studies, those are the main strands of literature that I draw on.
So you're interested in governance of destabilization?
Yeah. Well, so what I'm interested in the dissertation is the governance of destabilization, essentially from a double angle. So, because we could argue that destabilization could be seen as both the outcome of a change in policy or other governance activities, but governance can also be, or a change in policy can also be the result of regime destabilization. So essentially the argument behind this is that policy as a specific aspect of regime destabilization governance, and I make this in the dissertation, I make this point very repeatedly and very explicitly. I use the term regime destabilization governance because, of course, these are much broader processes involving a broad set of actors. But what I analyze specifically in the dissertation and the papers that go into it are questions of policy and policy change as one aspect of governance. That is, policy is not all of it, but it is certainly very important. And of course, for many years within the sustainability transitions community, it's been established that some sort of policy intervention is needed to drive sustainability transitions. But now the question is, how does policy and policy change specifically relate to regime destabilization? And then we get to this sort of double argument and this dual perspective, because policy is in many ways part of socio-technical regime. So it is really what keeps an established configuration going, what stabilizes it, and it is in a way that, I don't know, the PDFs that you can download on a government website are very much an expression of the logics at the core of a socio-technical regime. So a change in policy would then be indicative of a change in the socio-technical regime. For policy to change, there must be some change underlying in the institutional logics there. But at the same time, of course, a change in policy then again feeds back into the socio-technical configuration. And that is not just, it is not simply a feedback. So we cannot say that one comes from before the other, but they are, to a certain extent, I would say, independent processes of which we cannot specify a beginning and an end, and we can't really say which one comes first. So if a policy changes, for instance, in agriculture, or let's take the famous example of the German nuclear phase out, which people cut their teeth on for a decade now, I think, or much more even. Of course, that decision to phase out nuclear power changed something about the configuration of the system. And so policy is very much also an intervention into a regime, because then the degree of institutionalization of different social and technological aspects. So I don't know, the way that companies do business, the expectation that they have towards the power market and business opportunities in the future, and even the technologies that they are allowed to install changes. So we do have this double perspective and this dual relationship between policy and regime destabilization. The difficulty then is, how do we study it when we cannot really say which one comes first? And I wouldn't even dare to say which one is more important, because they're, of course, two very different, fundamentally different aspects of this relation. And so what I did in this dissertation to grapple with this problem is that I wrote different papers that take these perspectives, but separately. So there's one publication that studies policy change and then sort of infers the degree of regime destabilization from this. And then there are a few papers that study the potential for future change for a transition in agriculture based on changes in agricultural policy over time, and also the degree of change in policy and to what extent that is likely or unlikely to cause or to influence the transition in the future.
How did you sort of grapple with this problem of defining the object of the study? Because it is a process, it's a historical process of regime dynamics. It's also a political process and a policy-making process, but also something happens afterwards. And I guess you could choose to analyze it, the entirety of this thing, or do it by chunks. How did you approach this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as you can imagine, one that kept me up quite some nights. So again, my empirical field of inquiry was agricultural policy in Europe. So I wasn't exclusively looking at the common agricultural policy at EU level, but very much the interplay between the European and national governance levels. And I looked at several cases for the different papers. But even before that, we always have to ask, of course, how do we delineate the system that we're interested in? And then there's the old trap of methodological nationalism, just essentially arguing a the socio-technical system is, I don't know, German agriculture or um, or French agriculture or whatever. And of course, to a certain extent, that makes a lot of sense, especially if you're interested in policy, because that is really where policy is being made. Although you can, of course, look at like smaller slices of it, lower levels of governance. The same goes for the European level. To a certain extent, it makes sense to look at the European level as a whole, because agriculture was the first policy field to be so strongly Europeanized in the latter half of the 20th century, with the development of the Common Agricultural Policy over time, which has been for a very long time the largest European policy. Over 70% of the budget of the EU or its predecessor organizations actually went into funding agriculture. So it is a very, very strongly Europeanized policy field. And then I think for the individual studies, there were different rationales behind choosing the cases that I was looking at. So for instance, the first study really tried to identify conceptualizations of regime destabilization governance from the literature that actually started out as a literature review and evolved into something very different. And what I ended up finding is that there are essentially three different approaches in the literature to conceptualize regime destabilization governance. And instead of picking one, deciding that one of them was most convincing or merging them into one overarching approach for regime destabilization governance, I thought maybe it is interesting to compare them and see what we can actually learn from these approaches in the literature if we apply them to the same case. And so, of course, for that, I needed a case in which regime destabilization was relatively, or was likely to occur, at least some degree of destabilization, and it would need to have a very strong policy component. And so I chose pesticide governance in Germany, but of course, again, with very strong linkages to the European level, as an interesting case to study, because in pesticide governance, there are very strong changes, and over the 20-year period that we analyzed there, we went from an approach that essentially tries to mitigate the risks from applying pesticides to switching to quantitative reduction targets. And I mean, that is also the period over the past bit over 20 years now in which pesticide use has been very strongly politicized. Of course, it's an old topic with Silent Spring and all, but on the European level, there's definitely been or within Europe, there's been another push for the politicization of pesticides and a real shift in I would say the policy paradigm here. And so that proved to be a very good case. We tried others before that, and then took a deep dive into pesticides. And essentially, we picked similar strategy, or like for every single paper in the dissertation, there was a process of, okay, what is actually the best case within agricultural policy in Europe to answer the question at hand?
You also, yeah, indeed, you continued this kind of trend of meta-theoretical comparison, or at least you in the papers that make up your dissertation. So you have a paper that uses institutional theory. You have a paper that uses transformative outcomes and exnovation. The other one. What were your learnings coming out of this experience of applying different perspectives to study this topic? And sort of what approaches did you appreciate most, and why, maybe?
Oh, that is a good question. And of course, when writing up a framework paper for a dissertation, you still have to justify your own work, which I, to a certain extent, have to do here too.
Sorry.
So you can never say, I didn't like this one at all. It turned out to be crap.
Well, here you can say it. It's fine. It's not defense.
All of the approaches that I used proved to be useful. Certainly, they all show different aspects of this horribly complicated phenomenon of regime destabilization governance. But what we can learn from it is, or at least what I learned, is a lot of humility, because of course, again, I used, for instance, the transformative outcomes framework, and then a transitions pathways inspired framework, and a more sort of a regulatory perspective that essentially just compares policy output. I won't enumerate them here because I don't think that would be very fun to listen to, but I can. Maybe you will link to the papers in the end.
I will.
Also, the dissertation itself has been published now, the framework paper, so that can be read, and also my comparison of it. I think we we have to be very mindful when we do this sort of meta-theoretical comparison that concepts are not necessarily compatible, even though we use them to study very similar phenomena. So I don't know, if we're interested in discursive changes in processes of phasing out a particular technology, that is a very different analytical interest than looking at policy changes to fulfill certain destabilizing functions, because we look at different, not just because we look at different segments of the policy process. One would be much more sort of procedural, the other one would be, of course, strongly focused on policy output, but also because we have to be mindful that a discursive perspective can be linked to a very different ontology, but most importantly, probably a different epistemology than sort of a much more essentially quantitatively minded policy analysis here. But that's pretty obvious. What I learned then from applying these different perspective and lenses besides each other is that they struggle with similar things to a certain extent. So, for instance, it is very difficult to even grasp the concept of regime destabilization, because it is a conceptually defined analytical interest. So no policy, if we study policy, either processes or outcomes, of course, nobody ever says we want to destabilize a socio-technical regime. But what we then have to do, we have to come up with, we have to operationalize the concept of regime destabilization in a way that allows us to identify aspects of policy that relate to this overarching phenomenon. And how this operationalization occurs is very different. And some frameworks are sort of very concrete. They say, okay, here we look at, we try to find, I don't know, a phase out of a policy instrument, or policy instruments that phase out technologies or practices. So that is really straightforward. That would be a control policy in the terminology of Kivima and Kern, for instance. Those you can identify very easily, which also leads to the well, you identifying many of them in the literature. But if you are looking at more broadly defined goals, such as the ones that are specified in the transformative outcomes framework, like there is one category in there about increasing interactions between niches and regimes. Then of course you have to, when reading a policy, you have to kind of always have this question in the back of your head. How does this actually contribute to this, again, conceptually defined interest? And it leads you to the need to specify coding rules very, very, very carefully, and probably through many iterations. And so this struggle of coming up with good categories on which to base coding schemes for actually assessing regime destabilization governance is common to all of them, obviously common to all social research, but some are more useful than others, or certainly more easily to apply. And easy to apply is of course an aspect of usefulness, which doesn't mean that of course the more complicated, the ones that are more difficult to apply are overall less useful. But the time it takes to read through several thousand pages of policy documents when you have to adapt your coding scheme iteratively is substantial. So that is definitely something that we have to bear in mind. And then another thing that I learned is from my personal or my interest in this dissertation is that there is, of course, a huge literature on policy change. It's one of the central topics in political science. And there are libraries of books and papers on this. But it's actually, so if we want to link regime destabilization research to research on policy change, which makes a lot of sense, given that everybody seems to agree that policy is important in regime destabilization processes, we need a sort of conceptual fit, or categories that offer conceptual links to studying policy processes, ideally more widely. In the dissertation, I strongly focus on policy output, not exclusively, but for, let's say, economic reasons, because that gives you a good point of comparison. But frameworks for studying regime destabilization governance should offer more links to studying policy processes more widely. So policy formulation, policy output, implementation, and then very, very importantly, the outcomes of policy, which, funny enough, is something that the policy change literature really struggles to do themselves, because outcomes are never like monocausally linked to policy change. So if you want to study the effects of a policy, then of course you need to resort to far broader methods of analysis. And I would say that is also something that the sustainability transitions and the destabilization governance research needs to grapple with much more, to study outcomes of interventions into socio-technical systems. Actually, that the latter point is true whether you study regime destabilization or whether you study a sort of innovation-driven change. The outcomes of change are really important, and we need to link them to the interventions that we see. And of course, that is one of the strengths at the same time of sustainability transitions research, is that it is kind of fundamentally interested in socio-technical change. So you do not need to broaden your conceptual repertoire any further, because you already have, in the concept of a socio-technical system, or whatever configuration you look at more specifically, you already have these variables of interest, if you will. It's not just an not exclusively an institutional analysis.
Why agriculture? Does agriculture, as an empirical topic, does it lend itself to more cases of regime destabilization, or some other reason why you chose it?
It's a good question. I would say there are several reasons for it. First of all, it is an incredibly important policy field. I specified this before. There are on the EU level, roughly close to 60 billion euros are spent annually on in the CAP, vast sums of money. But then much more importantly, also for agricultural policy is extremely important for the way farming is being done. In Europe, almost a third, just over 30% of farm income is actually derived from subsidies, both direct payments and other forms of subsidies. And that is in a sector with very tight margins. So most farms operate on limited budgets and on very tight economic margins. So if something changes in this 1/3 share of farm income, which is of course what happens with any sort of major reform in agricultural policy, you will see substantial changes in the agricultural system, in the way agricultural goods are being produced. So that is something that I've always found very fascinating. It is a very strongly policy-driven sector, but at the same time, the CAP has always been this conundrum of extreme stability, but also strong contestation at the same time. So the processes of change in agricultural policy take a very, very long time. It is very difficult to change something about it because it is such a separate, it's such a distinct and closed off policy field. So, and then at the same time, of course, something I surprisingly haven't talked about yet, but the sustainability pressures in agriculture are huge. I mean, I've already talked about pesticides before, and that is because biodiversity loss on agricultural landscapes is rapid and increasing. Farming is also a substantial contributor to climate change. There was another paper in the PhD about peatland, or the aim to re-wet peatland, because roughly 40% of agricultural emissions in Germany are derived from farming on drained peatlands, even though they account only for roughly 7%, I think, of utilized agricultural area in Germany. And so you have these gigantic levers those are like several percentage points of all German emissions that just derive from a few percentage points of utilized agricultural area, which are consistently being drained. So we have biodiversity loss, we have carbon emissions, and at the same time, a structural change in farming that has been going on for decades, where the number of farms decrease, the number of people in agricultural employment decrease to the point where we're just, well, I don't actually know the current EU average. In most countries, it would be between 1% and 2% of the employed or of the working population being employed in farming. So anyway, strong structural changes that offer justification for intervening into farming. And this intervention now needs to pivot towards sustainability and has been claiming to pivot to sustainability for, well, just over 2 decades. But we don't really see positive outcomes on the sustainability side, or maybe the decline of biodiversity would have been even faster without these shifts. But still, the sustainability pressures remain huge, to the point where even large farming organizations, like the largest German farmers union, was part of a deliberative process, a commission that essentially stated that farming, as it is done in Germany right now, is ecologically unsustainable. And so we now have actually come to the point where farmers' unions recognize this and accept the need for change. And so I think it's a very fascinating topic. Also, one final point, but that one is a bit more meta. You could say, is what I enjoy about farming. I've lived on a farm myself for quite a while. I've done research on agriculture, not just on policy, but on the practice of doing agriculture for a while. Is when you study farming, the link between global abstractions such as biodiversity loss and very local, hyperlocal practices is short. So in specific farming practices that one farmer in central Norway, where I did a study a while ago, does on their field, that is inextricably linked to global biodiversity loss and greenhouse gas emissions from farming systems generally. And I think that is very fascinating, because it's much more hands-on than in other sectors. Don't get me wrong, I would never claim that agriculture is the only sector for which all of these are true. But it is certainly a very fascinating one. And we do see that in the transitions research community. There is, of course, now, and has been for a while, a pretty large subgroup of people studying transitions in agriculture. And then at the same time, there's a bit of a backlash, or I wouldn't call it a backlash, that's a big word, sorry, but there are doubts about the compatibility of, like, some people have uttered doubts about the compatibility of sustainability transitions and socio-technical transitions concepts for studying agriculture. But they have been, I would argue that they have been applied very fruitfully, and I think essentially the outcomes of that research should stand as a justification for studying it as one important sector in sustainability transitions research.
Yeah. What came to my mind as you were describing your interest in agriculture and destabilisation there is, how do you for yourself make a distinction between transition and destabilisation as a process?
Well, yeah, so it's a good question, I think. Analytically, yes. And again, I think the epistemological question behind that is, what is a transition even? To me, like we talk about in the transitions community, what binds us together is the concept of a socio-technical transition. And so we study processes of change in societal subsystems, and we throw this unified concept at these vastly different processes. And I mean, you have people studying, I don't know, changes in organization, the organizational structure of community-supported agriculture farms in Italy. And you have people studying changes in patent filings in the Chinese automotive industry. And we all claim that these are socio-technical transitions. And there's, of course, you could make fun of that. I think it's actually extremely powerful, because it brings together, without really fully reinventing the wheel every time, it brings together vastly different empirical studies and also different disciplines with the concepts that they have developed over decades to study processes of change and, of course, also relative stability and the reasons for change and stability. But it is worthwhile to stop every once in a while and think about the fact that we do study extremely different processes under the same term. So much maybe that much as a prelude. And I think this concept of the transition is useful to disaggregate it further. And well, essentially it means it is a normatively laden concept of change, because mostly what people do or what people are interested in are changes towards more sustainable system states, even though the sustainability, the actual sort of ecological and social and economic, if you will, outcomes are rarely assessed. But we do study processes of change. And it does make sense to disaggregate this further into change that is a change away from a certain from certain system configurations, from changes towards a novel system configuration in energy, agriculture, mobility, whatever. Yeah. Empirically, of course, these are almost always inextricably linked, and it would be difficult, probably impossible, certainly in a positive sense questionable, to completely distinguish these processes and separate them. But I think it makes sense to ask about these different directions of change, because we can ask slightly different questions, and it requires us to develop a conceptual repertoire that is much more nuanced than if we just talked about transitions as in something changes. And then again, I think the final point why I think it makes sense is that there is still, and of course you and many others have been writing about this for a very long time, but there is still a strong innovation bias. So especially change towards change towards sustainability transitions are still predominantly thought to derive from the introduction of novelty of one type or the other. And I'm saying by no means that destabilization is or sort of the withdrawal of something, which is one aspect of regime destabilization, is more important or whatever. But it can be a separate process. So I would say it offers an opportunity to develop a much more nuanced conceptual repertoire to study transition processes, if we distinguish between transitions and regime destabilization.
Yeah, I think at the last IST that we took part in, we heard from Lea Schilling that I think she phrased it as she has an intuition, that intuitive sort of hunch that destabilization is different, a completely separate process from transition, or from innovation rather. I'm not sure about transition. She thinks it's a separate process. So I guess what we are all with this studying destabilization, we're trying to figure out if that is the case and in what ways. So going away from the intuition towards more sort of putting it empirically supported.
Yeah, I would fully agree with that, and especially because innovation, and I think what is interesting about this is that innovation is always so much more palatable, especially politically. Like nobody's against innovation. And like for me as a, I don't know, muddy political scientist, post-political scientist, I don't know what to call myself here. Like as someone with a background in political science, I study policy very much. And so I'm very interested in changes in policy. And of course, it is always easy to adopt policy that supports some type of innovation, because by that, nobody has less of anything. Innovation support is easy to do, whereas policies that are geared towards decline of a socio-technical configurations are just inherently more politically challenging, and that point has been made repeatedly. It's not very original here, but I just think it is extremely important, and therefore from a policy and a politics perspective, I think it is very easy to see how they are different, how innovation and destabilization are clearly distinct, or innovation-driven change and sort of change through destabilization are different. It does, however, and I think that is something that we still have quite a lot of work for which we have work left to do, is we don't know too much, I would argue, about how innovation and destabilization are actually linked. Because of course, innovation plays a role in regime destabilization. Innovation doesn't, if you wanted the opposite of innovation, it would be more something like phase out or something much more concrete. But the role of innovation in destabilization, I think, is actually much more complicated. And I wouldn't dare to make too strong and clear statements about this at this stage. Maybe, I don't know, from your experience and
10 years
the
from now,
conversations
we
we've
will.
had. Yeah.
10 years from now. Going towards wrapping up, I did want to ask you about sort of the findings of your dissertation, maybe just sort of a very bite-sized list, maybe, or maybe the most important ones.
I think, well, there are a few conceptual insights that I already touched upon.
Yeah.
Like this conceptualization of regime destabilization from a policy change perspective.
Yeah.
Which I still think is worthwhile. I mean, it's not that long ago that I finished the PhD, so it's a good thing. But I think empirically, the findings, what struck me is that regime destabilization governance offers a novel way to analyze agricultural policy and changes in agricultural policy. And what it shows is that we find that there are destabilizing interventions in agricultural policy actually throughout all the cases that I studied. So again, pesticides, peatland governance. One study was on the UK, where we studied essentially changes in UK agricultural policy over the Brexit period. And then there's another paper on the French and German implementations of the Common Agricultural Policy in its last iteration. It's the one that came out very recently. And in every one of those papers, of course, also because of the way we selected cases, or I selected cases, but there was to me, sometimes surprising amount of destabilizing interventions, like in pesticides, again, 50% reduction target being introduced, substance bans, etc. In the UK study, for instance, there was a clear discussion of moving away from area-based area-based farming subsidies for the benefit of a system that researchers have been calling for decades, which is kind of more of an additionality-based biodiversity and conservation-oriented payment scheme, which is called the Environmental Land Management Scheme. What that actually has come to in the end is a different question. But in every one of these studies, there were destabilizing measures, but they were always far less systematic than would have needed. So we know from decades of research on agricultural policy what the main issues are. This area-based subsidy scheme. But it is extremely difficult to move away from them, that we have also known. And the changes are always very minor. And there's always much more introduction of novelty and new instruments, new subsidy schemes, etc., then there is a shift away from the established policy regime. I think that is essentially overarching the key insight here. The question is really, what do we learn from studying policy change when we are specifically interested in regime destabilization?
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can learn quite a bit. That's actually the point that the whole point of this peatland paper, because there's been it's a very niche topic, obviously, but within that within the peatland research community and the people doing research on agriculture that have an understanding of this issue, there have been calls for re-wetting peatlands for quite a while. And then usually what this amounts to is the demand to scale up agriculture on re-wetted peatlands, which is called paludiculture, to make this a viable business model, to support the practice, to develop technologies, and in that case, actually even more so business models, because the technologies mostly exist, or completely. But it is a very different question to ask, how can we actually move away from agriculture on drained peatlands entirely? It opens up a completely new governance task, if you will. Because the question then isn't how can we get more people to adopt paludiculture, but it is how can we intervene into an established way of doing agriculture. And the drainage of peatlands has been an extremely crucial step in the melioration of farmlands, especially in a country like Germany, which has substantial portions of its farmland, or at least some of it is on drained peatlands, and kind of making these arable was extremely important in the past, and you still have people farming today that sort of remember the toil that went into making these lands arable. And now we have to move away from this historical achievement, and we have to take a substantial share of the utilized agricultural area out of production in order to do that. And so again, the governance task becomes a different one. I wouldn't say the policy process is a different one, but it is done in it changes in a very different direction. And of course, this sort of and studying that systematically, like what would be needed in order to actually move away from agriculture on drained peatlands is a different question from how can we get more people to farm re-wetted peatlands. And I think that is kind of that's the added value here.
Yeah. What is next for you, Leonard? What are your current projects, future upcoming projects? Obviously, you are shout out to the thematic group destabilization to phase out in the STRN network that you are part of in terms of steering, right?
Time-intensive hobby, I would call it. So I think there are several aspects to that. As you announced in the beginning, I'm a postdoc researcher now, and I'm working in a project on regional carbon management, shifting back to energy a bit, which I've done research on in the past. Yeah. So we're essentially looking at CO2 infrastructure for CO2 transport, and we're also looking at a specific carbon sink that is biochar. At least that links to to land use, although less to agriculture. And the way we're studying it, that's the day job. There are more research projects and grants in the works. I've become very interested in, I think I've hinted to this a few times, to the politics of transitions and regime destabilization specifically. I think understanding the backlash and sort of anti-transformative projects is crucial for determining the success of sustainability transitions in the future. Something that I'm really interested in researching more in the future.
What do you mean by anti-transformative?
I think it makes sense to study or to understand movements like the worldwide success of the populist authoritarian far right.
Oh yeah.
And the policy platforms on which they run, at least where they touch on environmental and sustainability issues, as anti-transformative projects, because they're very much a pushback and literally a backlash against the transformative agendas that have been, I wouldn't say dominant, but like that have been pretty high profile over the past years with the Green Deal and everything. And so I think this more political side is interesting to study. And then besides that, I've been recently appointed a member of the STRN steering group, which I'm very excited about. So I will join that. I've transitioned from Nest, where I was very active for a number of years, to the STRN steering group, which I'm excited to start working with. And then, of course, there's the D2P, the destabilization to phase out thematic group within STRN, where we have a number of seminars coming up. I will send out, well, by the time this podcast is published, I'm sure the email will have already been out. So we have monthly sessions planned from September onwards for essentially the whole academic year. And there will be, we're working on different formats and ideas for events to really support and give some sort of structure to the academic community that is crystallizing around research on regime destabilization, phase out, decline, discontinuation, whatever you want to call it. We ended up with this sort of catch-all term for the thematic group. And that will, again, they'll keep an eye out on the newsletter, the STRN newsletter on LinkedIn for that, because there's going to be quite a lot of activity and opportunities for everyone who's interested to engage.
Fantastic. Leonard, did you want to add anything that I didn't ask about?
It's a good question. I think I've been in this field for 6 years or so now. And I'm still very excited about the sustainability transitions community for two main reasons. First, that the community is excellent, and I think that makes a huge impact, at least on me, for my PhD journey. Don't really like the term. It was very, very important to have this community of like-minded scholars with whom you can exchange on a very informal basis. It's very active, and I think that is a tremendous asset that we can't value enough. But also, content-wise, I'm still very excited about the research field because it, as I said before, I think it allows us to bring together different insights from quite a range of academic disciplines under a shared research interest. And the terminology that we have and the conceptual repertoire really kind of acts as a boundary object for people who would probably not be able to talk to each other so well, and certainly wouldn't meet if we just hung out at, I don't know, business and economics and political science and sociology conferences. So that, I think, is extremely important. And I'm really looking forward to, also as part of the SDRN steering group, to try to keep that momentum going. And I think, yeah, important for me at least to take a step back every once in a while and appreciate this.
Perfect insight, perfect inspiring words to end on. Thank you so much, Leonard, for this talk.
Thank you so much, Zaha, for having me. It was a pleasure.